Bridgen.
Mr Deputy Speaker, on the 13th of December last year, I was kindly granted an adjournment debate on the potential harms that emergency use experimental mRNA COVID-19 vaccines cause. It's fair to say that night my life changed. During that speech, in the evidence data I presented to the House, which no one has effectively rebutted, I highlighted to the Minister the scale of harms that the experimental vaccines have caused and continue to cause. In giving that speech to an almost empty chamber on this most important of issues, quite literally life and death, two things happened to me immediately. First, I was cancelled by the mainstream media, despite sending a data sheet in the wake of the debate, scientifically evidencing every point that I made. Not one media organisation wanted to talk about the issue of serious harms or death occurring as a result of the mRNA vaccines. Mr Deputy Speaker, I fully expect that they will show the same level of disinterest in today's debate. It's what we've come to expect from a media more interested in navel-gazing at the pontifications of Britain's foremost football pundit instead of the horror and tragedy of excess deaths taking place before their very eyes. Some 3 months on from that speech, and a scattering of reports are now appearing in the mainstream media, sadly, the number of people affected in the UK and across the world cannot be ignored or hidden indefinitely.
Well, now, way.
I will on that point.
Will you accept that there's a bit of light on the horizon in that this week alone, the Daily Express has had 4 full pages on this subject?
I thank my right honourable friend. He's a stalwart supporter for those who've been vaccine harmed, and I do hope that we can see some light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully this speech today will bring more light into the darkness. In truth, I care little about being cancelled by the media, because in the wake of that speech, something far more important has happened. I was contacted by thousands of people offering their support and received many hundreds and hundreds of emails from all over the globe recounting to me their own stories of the harms caused in the wake of their or their loved ones' COVID vaccination. I've been contacted by parents in my own and surrounding constituencies thanking me for questioning why we're giving these experimental vaccinations to healthy children and young people that patently do not need them and gain no protection from them. I was contacted by far too many relatives who had lost loved ones suddenly after having the Moderna, Pfizer or AstraZeneca experimental gene therapy treatments shot into their arms. Many of them asked in their emails why this vitally important issue was not being taken more seriously by many of my honourable and right honourable colleagues. That, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a question for my colleagues to answer. A lot more questioned why, as evidence continues to emerge almost on a daily basis, the Fourth Estate was so remiss in its coverage. That, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a question for the lobby to answer. But every one of those who contacted me asked me to keep up the fight, to continue to raise awareness of vaccine harms and vaccine deaths. Mr Deputy Speaker, that is the question I am here to answer today. Despite the media silence, there is huge, enormous and growing interest in this topic. So today I once again ask the Minister why more is not being done, both in the United Kingdom and globally, to investigate and publicise the clear and well-documented adverse effects of COVID-19 vaccines. Vaccines, Mr Deputy Speaker, that have made Big Pharma billions, but also vaccines that have resulted in completely unprecedented levels of yellow card reports. Mr Deputy Speaker, the government's own data in this respect is damning. It is interesting that only this week the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency, have announced that they will no longer be publicly reporting the yellow card updates from the reported harms of these experimental treatments. Can the Minister explain the reasoning behind this decision, especially given that the number of yellow card reports of adverse events are far higher for the experimental COVID-19 vaccine than the total yellow card reports of all conventional vaccines administered for the last 50 years. Mr Deputy Speaker, if you'll grant me a little leeway, let me start by looking at data from the US state of Florida and the reported level of vaccine harms there. Prior to the COVID pandemic, there were never more than 2,500 incidents per year of harms reported to the State Surgeon General as a direct result of vaccination. In 2021, that number shot up to over 41,000 cases, a surge of more than 1,600%. Of course, some will understandably point out that the increase in cases was inevitable as more vaccines were being administered. The answer to that, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the state of Florida, there was a 400% increase in vaccine administration in 2021, not 1,600%. Mr Deputy Speaker, in the state of Florida and in the rest of the world, 1,600 doesn't go into 400. It never has, and it never will. The real-world data from Florida shows the mRNA vaccines are resulting in vaccine harms disproportionate to the number of vaccines being administered when compared to all previous vaccinations. And this backs up the clear warning signal from our own yellow card system in the UK. Data held on the US Government National Library of Medicine was used for research by Dr. Joseph Fryman, which details the frequency of serious adverse events following vaccination with both Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines. For clarity, Mr Deputy Speaker, a serious adverse event is defined as anything that results in death, is life-threatening at the time of the event, results in inpatient hospitalisation or prolongation of existing hospitalisation, persistent or significant disability or incapacity, a congenital anomaly or birth defect, or something considered as medically important based on medical judgment. Using that definition, the study confirms that there are 10.1 serious adverse events for every 10,000 Pfizer vaccinations administered. Mr Deputy Speaker, that means that 1 in every 990 people vaccinated with the Pfizer booster will have a serious adverse event. The risk with the Moderna vaccine is even greater. There are 15.1 serious adverse events for every 10,000 Moderna jabs. That means 1 in 662 people vaccinated with the Moderna booster will have a serious adverse event. Combining the data for Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines, or boosters, we can see that there are an average of 1,250 serious adverse events for every 1 million vaccine boosters administered. In other words, an average of 1 in 800 chance of a serious adverse event every time someone is boosted. So let's move on now to the UK government data. On the 25th of January of this year, the Department of Health and Social Care published data from a presentation given by the UK Health Security Agency to the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. The data published split the population into groups by age and further divided those age groups into those considered healthy and at risk. The numbers needed to vaccinate, or the NNV, for each of these subgroups were calculated to firstly prevent a single hospitalisation and secondly a single serious hospitalisation requiring oxygen or intubation, effectively intensive care. The figures are stark, Mr Deputy Speaker. What I'm quoting from is the government's own published data. To prevent just one healthy adult aged between 50 and 59 from being hospitalised due to COVID, the government's own data states that 43,600 people had to be given an autumn booster jab. With a serious adverse event rate of 1 in 800, that means that in the healthy 50 to 59-year-old group, as a result of using the mRNA boosters, 55 people would die or be put into hospital with side effects to prevent one single case of COVID preventing in hospital. The same data shows that for the healthy younger people, the number needs to be boosted to prevent a single hospital admission with COVID-19 is far higher. 92,500 booster jabs were required to be administered to prevent one hospitalisation due to COVID in the healthy 40 to 49-year-old group, which would simultaneously have put 116 people at probability of death or serious adverse reaction into hospital from the jab. The healthy 30 to 39-year-old age group required 210,400 booster jabs to prevent a single COVID hospitalisation. So 263 of this group will have been into hospital or sadly died as a result of the booster side effects just to keep one COVID case out of hospital. But the data gets worse because hospitalisation doesn't necessarily mean a serious medical intervention, such as intubation or oxygen. To prevent severe hospitalisation from COVID-19, the numbers needed to be boosted become astronomical. I would suggest that this is the real benchmark for comparison with the risks of death or serious adverse events from the boosters themselves. So the government's own data shows that in healthy adults aged 50 to 59, it was necessary to give 256,400 booster jabs to prevent just one severe hospitalisation, putting 321 people into hospital with a serious side effect from the booster, which includes, obviously, risk of death. For 40 to 49-year-olds, that number increases to 932,500 who need to be boosted to keep one COVID patient out of ITU, putting potentially 1,165 people into hospital with serious harms, death or disability. And for the healthy 30 to 39-year-olds, no one knows the answer to the number needed to be boosted to prevent a serious hospitalisation, because the government's own data says that there's never been such a case of this age group being put into intensive care due to the current variant of COVID-19. But many, indeed on average 1 in 800 of them, of this group that's been boosted, will have died or been disabled or seriously harmed by the booster itself. Let me focus now on the most vulnerable group for which the government data is available, the over 70s with comorbidities, the most vulnerable group in our society. According to the government's own data, it would be necessary to administer 800 vaccine boosters to prevent just one hospitalisation for a patient over the age of 70 in this highest risk group. Mr Deputy Speaker, that means that all the most vulnerable group in our society are doing, by being boosted, is swapping one risk from COVID of hospitalisation for exactly the same risk from the booster itself. But of course, in the process, Big Pharma is making huge profits. Mr Deputy Speaker, we've looked at the health implications of the vaccine programme. Now I want to look at some of the costs implications of the booster programme in the UK. Total funding of COVID-19 vaccination programme in the UK up to the end of March this year is budgeted at £8.3 billion. In February 2022, the GP online website, championing general practice professionals, published that GPs and community pharmacies were being paid £24 per dose for administering vaccines. That figure increased to £34 per dose at dedicated vaccine centres. These costs, of course, do not include the cost of the experimental vaccines themselves. For ease of calculation, I will count those at £20 per dose across the board. I will be generous and use the lower of the two figures for administering the vaccine, giving a total cost of £44 per dose. But even then, we see from the government's own data, using boosters, it cost over £1.9 million to prevent just one hospitalisation among healthy 50 to 59-year-olds, and over £11 million to prevent one serious hospitalisation due to COVID-19 in this age group. The cost to the taxpayer of preventing a hospitalisation of one healthy 40 to 49-year-old is over £4 million using boosters, and for healthy 30 to 39-year-olds, the cost of preventing just one hospitalisation is over £9 million, Mr Deputy Speaker. Of course, to prevent serious hospitalisation in all these groups, the cost is far, far higher. It is, of course, worth noting that in setting up the vaccine programme, the government indemnified vaccine manufacturers, which gave them total cover against all future claims of the adverse effects of their products. Given what I've already explained about the incidence of serious side effects, that cost may well be extremely significant to the taxpayer on top of the obvious human tragedy and loss which is self-evidently happening. The data is clear. For all healthy people and all those considered at risk under 70, the probability of being seriously harmed by COVID are seriously outweighed by the risk associated from the experimental vaccines and boosters. Even for the most vulnerable group, the over 70s, with health problems, the risks are absolutely identical. The government data comments not only on the efficacy and effectiveness of the autumn booster campaign, which I've quoted from. We've already had that. But it also looks forward to this year's booster.